start with this side of the table and go around, and everybody understands only Madison Forum members can exchange in the dialogue. And these are dialogues, it's not just a quick question answer. But you gotta open, the topic you open with has to be the topic you stay with on an exchange. There's no free grazing. The next person can pick another subject.
That's rigorous.
It is. This is the way we've always done it. It works. It's law. Okay. So it keeps order, it keeps people from monopolizing, you just keep go through the list. All right, Jim.
Very quickly, I don't remember much from law school, but I remember what the professor said. It's not what the law says, it's how it is interpreted that counts. Bob, you're a man with vast experience. Tell us what we the people can do to save our country that we're losing a day at a time. Our question.
Yeah. Well, on one level, the answer is very simple. Do what you're doing today, every day, in every aspect of your life, whether it is through your professional work, through those of us, those that have kids in school, pay attention to what's going on in the schools, pay attention to who we elect to school board, very important positions, but very often sort of overlooked and not really looked at substantively. Look at what textbooks our kids are using. Look at the mandates from the state with regard to educational requirements. That's certainly very important. Attend meetings, the county commission, and perhaps more than anything else, don't buy into this notion that political issues can be debated and resolved by looking at red state, blue state map. Whoever came up with that, I mean, has done a great disservice because it simplifies things to the degree that debate is meaningless. You look at it, and Republicans nationally, and I think the state have done a disservice. What they do is they look at the map, red state, blue state. Oh, a state is blue, therefore that means something. That means it's Republican. Red state, vice versa, I guess. Red state or Republican. I don't know how we got stuck with red. Anyway, I guess it was them.
Bob, I have an
with
answer.
the color.
I know.
You finish your.
Okay. So Republicans look at, and Democrats probably also, look at this map and red state, blue state, that identifies the issues, it clarifies the problems and the solutions. What it does, it takes attention away from where the real problems are, and that is here, the grassroots level. It's one thing to look at a map and say, well, Georgia is still red. Maybe not as red, but it's red. Well, you delve down, and that's the answer to your question. That's what we need to do. Delve down far below that. If you look at what's happening in local government, state and local government, where you see Republicans in office passing far more regulatory mandates than previously when the other party was in control, where you see Republicans pressing for increased regulations at all levels, construction, home building, businesses, where you see Republicans pressing for taxes, where you see crony capitalism at work. If you simply sort of ignore that and look at the big issue, those problems are not going to get resolved, and they're just going to get worse. So I think one thing we can do, I know this isn't a Republican group, and we're not here to talk Republican or Democrat politics, but to demand and do what we can to get people who are involved in politics, in elective office or administrative party politics, to forget about this nonsense of red state, blue state, and look at what's actually happening. What are people doing at the local government level, at the state level, and do everything that we can to correct that, to bring these issues to the forefront, which is not happening. I mean, there are far too few Madison forums out there. We need more in other groups. There also need to be some court challenges brought on some of these issues. Not the sort that we see the liberals doing, where President Trump will do something through an executive order or executive proclamation, and then they find a district court judge somewhere that's sympathetic, and they issue, this nonsense, this notions of nationwide injunctions. We can get into that. I mean, that's a real problem also. But again, born of ignorance. People don't understand that the jurisdiction of a federal district court does not, except in extraordinary circumstances, extend beyond the federal judicial district. Yet you have these judges, particularly out in the Ninth Circuit,
right?
The district court judges in the Ninth Circuit, and then they're affirmed by Ninth Circuit judges, issuing nationwide jurisdictions, highly inappropriate. But we allow that to happen.
Yeah, I wanted to make a comment on the red state, blue state. Some years ago, I was watching NBC, and it was being, on election return night, it was being hosted by Tom Brokaw. And Tom, being the smug guy, that liberal guy that he is, he said, I made a suggestion that we color the states red and blue, respective of the parties. And he said, I thought it was quite appropriate to call the Republican states red, since they have such a phobia about the Reds. And that's how it happened. And the Republican Party happily went along with it. So, going over. Yes, Michael.
Yes, thank you for your presentation here this morning, and I'd like to take advantage of your experience to simply ask, will any of us live long enough to see conservatives on either side address spending in government? Or are we looking at a national debt that will be like a thermometer in a hot room continuing to go up?
It's an excellent question. One that one generation ago would have been easy to answer, because tackling the national debt and balancing the budget was an absolute pillar of the Republican Party. I mean, when I was in the Congress, I mean, that was one of the things we were very, very clear on. Not 100%, but of Republicans up there, but it was a very clear pillar of the Republican Party. And as a matter of fact, that was part of the Balanced Budget and Welfare Reform Act in 1997. Balanced budget. Lasted until we had a Republican president, strangely enough. The only person that now, strangely enough, seems, at least at the presidential wannabe level, who's talking about that is Howard Schultz. None of the others are. As a matter of fact, not only, I mean, we have the trifecta. Not only are they not talking about the national debt, but Democrats are talking about spending trillions into the future for free stuff for everybody, and this Green New Deal. I don't know how anybody can talk about that with a straight face. But anyway, they're talking about spending trillions into the future. And now some of them are looking backward and saying, well, let's spend trillions of dollars for what went on in the past, reparations. So they're not addressing the problem with the national debt and how that sucks up productive resources in society that could be used for truly productive purposes. They are talking about unlimited spending into the future, and now they're talking about unlimited spending for the past. I mean, in that environment, with nobody really arguing contrary to it, other than Republicans certainly are saying nonsense, there's no way in the real world the Green New Deal could be implemented, it's just nonsense. That's fine, that's an easy argument to make. But actually talking about getting a handle on spending, balancing the budget as a first step, and really tackling the national debt, what is it, 20 trillion now? It's no longer, it doesn't seem to be any longer a part of a real element of the Republican Party platform. I'm sure it'll be in I don't know, where's the next convention? I don't even know. Wherever that is, I'm sure that the platform will have something in there about it, but nobody's addressing it. It was addressed substantively a generation ago, in the late 1990s. Answer to your question is, it doesn't appear that we're going to live to see anybody really do anything about that. I don't think that Howard Schultz will be elected president, but he's, as far as I can tell right now, the only person in either party or even an independent even talking about it. And I give him credit for at least doing that.
Jim?
So, see if I can properly cast this question. I have some vague recollection of back in the 1800s of incursion by Mexico or Mexicans in the U.S. and the acts of states is in defending their territories. And this kind of me goes to this whole question of national emergency, the executive authority, and what the federal government has the right to do. Fortunately, I don't know if this is a question for you, Mr. Barr or Ms. Jeffries, but my real question is, historically, what rights do the states retain to defend against incursion? Because we all have the spirit of posse comitatus, I think. So, any thoughts on that, or any historical insight on that?
Yes, but in terms of really solving it, I mean, it's extremely complex, certainly. Back however many years ago it was when Arizona passed State Bill 10, I forget the name of the legislation, that addressed what they identified as an immigration crisis. And the legislation went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court upheld parts of it and threw out certain parts of it. Parts of it, clearly, at least to me as a constitutional conservative, were bad. Saying, "Show us your papers." Walking down the street, please demand, "Let me see your citizenship papers." But there were other elements of it that were appropriate, that were upheld. The basis on which the Arizona legislature debated and passed that was to address precisely the problem that you've identified. They said the federal government has responsibility for protecting the border, the national border. They are failing to do so. Therefore, we, the state of Arizona, in order to protect our citizens against the clear and present danger of persons coming into Arizona unlawfully committing crimes here, we are going to pass a law, whatever the state bill number was, I think, to do so. And it raises, it puts front and center the question of whether or not a state can take action in an area that is reserved to the federal government if the federal government is failing to meet that responsibility. And it works the other way as well. Can the federal government enlist state authorities to carry out federal authorities? In the immigration area still, okay, the federal government says, we don't have sufficient manpower to properly ensure that all of those persons who are in a particular state unlawfully, illegal immigrants, illegal aliens, are identified and dealt with. So we're going to, in a sense, deputize, not formally, but deputize state law enforcement, local law enforcement officials to do that. Well, that's the other side of that coin. Can state and local law enforcement be clothed with the authority to assist in enforcing federal law? So you have to look at it both ways. But I think ultimately there is a lot that a state can do to protect its citizens from the threat of persons coming in unlawfully and committing criminal acts. Where that line is properly between the basic sovereign responsibility to enforce the sovereignty of our borders, which is federal government, and where a state can step in because the federal government is arguably failing to do so, it was one that hasn't really been yet defined.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's as simple as just building a wall.
Yeah, but it does bring into clear focus the importance of that fourth branch of government, i.e. the states themselves and the balance of power. So
Yeah. It's a very, very timely issue.
Christina?
Don't you think that the states really have the advantage here? Because the courts, we're both interested in gun rights, the courts have said, no, the states cannot be forced to run the federal government's background checks, right? But the states have police powers. And I don't think that Georgia could, send people down to Texas and say, well, that's where all these illegals are getting to. They're coming through Texas. I don't think they could do that. But Texas could say, we have the police power to police right up to the border.
Yeah, in fact, they're doing that, I think, at least the attempt to do that in the state legislature of Texas.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, if I were hired to write a legal brief on it, I do think that the states have the power and have a stronger argument as against those that say, hey, this is a federal responsibility. You can't do anything, even if we don't have the resources to do so. It's our responsibility. So, buy out.
Going around the table, next Madison Forum Member, if you have a question, raise your hand. Yes.
When I was saying that Bob Barr was right, I was merely agreeing with Bob Barr, as I always do.
Thank you.
That bump stock bill was pretty scary. I'm not sure what form it got passed in, but I read the bill from front to rear, and there were a lot of circular references in there that had nothing to do with bump stocks.
Yeah, and that's why the NRA, for example, strongly opposed it. Not because the NRA was particularly interested in, and I don't speak for the NRA, by the way.
Sure.
Not because the NRA was particularly interested in bump stocks per se, but the very broad language in the legislation that had been introduced right in the wake of the Las Vegas shooting would have brought in all manner of accessories for firearms, and not just bump stocks. But rather than Congress address it and say, okay, we'll narrow it down so that it addresses just that particular device, even if that is a legitimate exercise of the Congress, let's say it is, to narrow it down and do that. Congress was afraid to do so, apparently, so they just, again, kicked it over to the executive branch.
Yeah, wow.
There is, by the way, if I could mention one thing not directly related to that, but with regard to Second Amendment issues as well, there are two pieces of legislation that I think will come before the full House this coming week. Both of them have to do with background checks. It's H.R. 8 and H.R. 1112. H.R. 8 is pretty straightforward. I wrote about it this week. Pretty straightforward. It addresses the so-called gun show loophole. It would make virtually any transfer of a firearm, other than essentially between immediate family members or a very temporary one, loaning it to somebody while you're at the gun range, unlawful unless it goes through the NICS check. H.R. 1112, that's bad. H.R. 1112 is more insidious. It's much cleverer. What H.R. 1112 does is it addresses the question of how much time the government, that is the FBI, which administers the NICS system, can take to approve or disapprove a requested transfer from an FFL. And if you look on the surface, it basically would seem to say, well, this, the current law, which provides that if once a request, what is the form, 4423 or 4733? Pardon me, 4473. Once that form is submitted to NICS, and if it is not disproved, or an answer is not received within 3 business days, then the transfer can go forward. That's the current law. HR 1112 on the surface simply seems to say that's too short, we need to extend that. But if you do the math and you look at a 10-day period that it requires and then having to re-request and then another 10-day period, but it's only business days, so it doesn't include a weekend, doesn't include a holiday. And if I think either 2 10-day periods go by, I'm not absolutely certain, you have to wait another 30 days or another month. If you calculate out the time periods involved, there would only be less than half of the months in the year in which you could purchase a firearm, because you would be stuck in this loop of going to the NICS, going to the FBI, and if there's no response and you have to resubmit it, and if you calculate that out, as I say, I think there's only like 5 or 6 months out of the year in which there are enough days, working days, business days, to process that. So it would essentially put gun businesses out of business, because you would only be able to purchase a firearm through an FFL about half the months out of the year. I mean, it's just crazy, but I would not be at all surprised, certainly if it passes the House, but I worry about the Senate, because on the surface it seems to be very benign. Well, we're just extending that 3-day period to 10 days.
No.
Bob, it was mentioned a few minutes ago regarding the state's ability to almost defend the border, to approach the border. Article 1, Section 10.3 states, no state shall, without the consent of Congress, lay duty of tonnage, keep troops or ships of war in time of peace, enter into any agreement or compact with another state or with a foreign power, or engage in war unless actually invaded or in such imminent danger as will not admit of delay. Our president has already said we are being invaded. So I'd like, if you could, without having given a lot of thought perhaps to this, give this consideration, a little bit of reasoning to us to help us process this.
Well, I suppose it all depends on what the meaning of the word invade is.
Do they have to have a uniform?
It goes back to language. But not just language, but the context in which that language was crafted, placed in the Constitution, and ratified as such. Now, granted, at that time, perhaps, well, we didn't even have a border with Mexico, but I really don't think that a reasonable interpretation of that provision would carry with it the power to, or the context that people coming across the border unlawfully, individually or in groups, is an invasion from the standpoint of what action a state cannot take. Now, in other words, yes, there are a lot of people coming across the border. It varies over time. I've seen studies that indicate that the numbers are less now than they were at other times in the past, in the recent past, but it's clearly a problem. And yes, some of those individuals do come across here to commit crimes, or the process of coming across is part of a criminal activity. They're bringing drugs across, for example. I would not subscribe to an interpretation of that provision that would have anything to do with a state not being able to stop individuals coming across. They're not invading our country. I don't interpret the term invade or invasion that way. My view of that provision in the context that these words were written was from a military standpoint. I mean, our framers, our Madison and our founders, they were looking at this in terms of how do we protect this new nation from being invaded. They had in mind particularly the European powers. We had that problem to some extent just 20 years later or whatnot, the War of 1812. So I think that a state has power to protect its citizens, whether that is protecting its citizens from people coming across the border or who are already in the state, regardless of that provision. Now, if the state mobilized a militia, and sent those state militia troops to the border, that would be a different question. But I think the exercise, as Christina was saying, of the police power of the state, and to me, police power does vest in states far more than in the federal government. The federal government police power is basically, the border. I think the states certainly would have the authority to do that, other than stationing state militia troops or whatnot at the border.
Thank you. Yes, Bill?
Bob, and thanks for being here. It's been delightful. I'd like to turn the conversation a little bit towards the Supreme Court. And it seems, in my opinion, non-lawyer, that Justice Roberts seems to be taking on the role of Justice Kennedy since he retired, that he's moving to the middle. I'd really just like to hear your comments about the court in general and maybe anything specific that you might be involved with or concerned about.
Well, the few petitions that I've sent to the Supreme Court, petitions for certiorari, over the years have all been declined. So I haven't had them take one of my cases, so I don't have a great track record there. But I love Clarence Thomas. I mean, I think of all of the current justices and all of those who have in recent years served on the court, he is the strongest constitutionalist and the most consistent. Very rarely do I find myself disagreeing with a case that, one of his opinions, whether it's on the Second Amendment or on the drug issue, for example. He's even stronger than Justice Scalia, as good as he was. There's a case that we were talking about before the program this morning called slaughterhouse cases, which is a case back from the late 19th century that dealt with the privileges or immunities clause in the 14th Amendment. Privileges or immunities of citizenship means those rights with which we are clothed that predate the Constitution. And 14th Amendment, that provision of the 14th Amendment stands for the proposition that a state cannot impair those. Well, is the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms, such a privilege or immunity? I think clearly it is. Yet, the most recent time that the Supreme Court addressed that issue, whether the right to keep and bear arms is a privilege or immunity which insulates it from being limited by state action, was the McDonald case in 2010, and the Supreme Court, with Justice Scalia and the majority, declined to find that Illinois law that made it essentially unlawful to possess a firearm. It was the city of Chicago, but they were acting in the grant of authority from the state of Illinois, so it's a state power question. The Supreme Court instead decided it on a much narrower issue of, due process, substantive due process, which to me is just a made-up term, it's meaningless. The privilege of immunity is not made up, it's there in the Constitution, the language is there. So one of the problems I have with the court is sort of the Justice Scalia issue, and that is they sometimes reach the right result, but for the wrong reason, on too narrow a ground. So I would love to see, more Justice Thomas's on there. Now, in the decision that came out earlier this week, what was the name of it?
Tibbs, T-I-B-S.
Case out of Indiana? Indiana or Illinois. It had to do with asset forfeiture. And it involved an individual who was charged with a drug offense, who pled guilty to that drug offense. The charge to which he pled guilty carried with it, in addition to a prison term, a $10,000 fine, if I'm not mistaken. Yet the state authorities seized his car, which I think was a new Land Rover or something, worth $40,000. Under this notion that, well, if you use that Land Rover to drive to where you're committing a crime, it's an instrumentality, and we can seize it or whatnot. What the Supreme Court decided was a good decision. It was unanimous, as a matter of fact. Gorsuch wrote a very, very good, very short to the point concurring opinion. Justice Thomas wrote a very, very good, more lengthy concurring opinion. But the court held unanimously that the fine has to be commensurate with the offense. So if you have an offense, the penalty, the pecuniary penalty for which is $10,000, you can't seize $40,000. That is an excessive fine. The same as, in that same clause, excessive bail. Excessive fines are not allowed. But the court didn't reach that decision or base its decision on the fact that there is a privilege or immunity against what the government was doing, nor did they reach the more fundamental question of this whole notion of asset forfeiture to begin with. So, answer to the question is, I'm glad that we have Justice Gorsuch on there. I'm delighted that we have Justice Thomas still on there. Justice Kavanaugh, it's a little bit early. Haven't really seen a lot from him, but he obviously was part of this unanimous decision. Justice Roberts seems to have, we saw this going back to the original Obamacare case a number of years ago. In addition to looking at questions before the court from a substantive standpoint, from a legal standpoint, he seems to look at these cases through the lens of how is the court perceived?
Right.
Are we perceived as being fair? Are we perceived as not being partisan? Are we perceived as being collegial? Which to me should have nothing to do with what cases they take and on what basis they render those decisions. But that, I think, unfortunately, is coloring to some extent how he's operating on the court, as opposed to being, the strong constitutionalist that I think he is, and that's unfortunate. But we do have the two justices that the President Trump nominated and that were confirmed. I think are both very good. From what I've seen of Judge Gorsuch, certainly he's written more, joined in more opinions than Kavanaugh has. But we haven't really gotten to the really tough decisions yet.
Can I ask a follow-up, Michael?
As long as it's on the same
It's
topic.
on the court. Justice Ginsburg's health has been an issue, and she's 85 years old, and it, she might live to be 185. But let's make an assumption here that she's the next justice to retire either by death or voluntarily, which I don't think will happen voluntarily. There was, in the last go-around, there was this lady, and maybe you guys know her name. She's in her late 40s, and she's of the Catholic faith, and has 6 or 7 children, who was, I think she's a district judge or whatever. I can't.
She's a professor.
Yeah?
I'm sorry.
No, what was her name? Do you know?
Amy something.
Cody.
Yeah. She seems to be the front runner from what I can read and hear in terms of another vacancy that may come up. She might be the next nominee. Do you know anything about her, Bob, or that? I find it interesting in terms, particularly with the way Justice Kavanaugh was attacked by Feinstein and the others. I thought, man, my wife worked in the legal field for 30 years, and she said, bring it on. She's ready for this gal to get up there, and they're attacking her because she would be a woman or of the Catholic faith. I don't know whether you know anything about is this, if this possibility came about, what might happen.
I do recall, I don't recall her name,
Right.
but I do recall reading about her,
Yeah.
learning a lot about her during the Kavanaugh process. I actually remember her name coming up during the Gorsuch nomination as well.
Right.
From what I recall, she seems to be very solid in terms of strong constitutional conservative understanding. I haven't gone over her record with a fine-tooth comb, but my impression, based on what I remember, particularly from the Kavanaugh proceedings, when her name was figured prominently, that she would probably be very good from our standpoint.
Good. Thanks. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Really.
Coming on around?
I have a question, and thank you for being here
Sure.
today. Do you feel like, having been one of our legislators, do you feel like our current legislators really do read the emails that come from their constituents and pay attention to what we say?
Some of them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, some of them meaning some of the members do, and some of them meaning they actually do read some of the emails. But by and large, no.
So when we do take the time to send an email or call about such as HR 8 or HR 1112 and say whether we're for it or against it, it's, they don't take that into consideration.
It's not meaningless. Generally speaking, they will have staff people that and legislative staff that do, look at all those. Whether it reaches the congressman or congresswoman's attention is a much different question.
Okay.
If you are somebody who is known to them, they may very well. But it's numbers more than a particular email that counts. If you can get a lot of emails on a particular topic. And as I always encourage people back when I was in the House, we didn't use email so much back then, but letters. To the point, single issue, polite, your chances of having, and numbers, getting a lot of people to do the same thing. Not so much where everybody sends the same email in, but if you can get, say, members of this group, on a particular issue, this is very important to us. We want everybody to send an email to their representative on this particular topic, urging them to look at it and vote a certain way or whatnot. That will work. But there's no substitute for in-person town hall meetings. I don't know, are we in Loudon Oaks District here in the 11th?
Yes.
I'm not sure how many town hall meetings Barry has, or how many, well, McBath is new, I don't know how many she'll have. We used to have a lot of town hall meetings throughout what was my 7th district at the time. And that still is the best way to make sure that your point is going to be heard and addressed, at least to some extent. Go to town hall meetings. And if members don't hold enough town hall meetings, do everything you can to encourage them to do so. And I know that part of the problem nowadays is some of these town hall meetings become so uncivil. Going back to, I guess, I remember the Obamacare debate and so forth, that caused some members to back away from holding town hall meetings, which is unfortunate. But that's the best way to do it. Or even just to go by the member's district office, and let them know, leave a letter with them, or just show up and tell them, look, I'm very interested. I see that HR 8 is coming up for a vote this week. Please urge the congressman to vote, in this case, against it.
Ben?
One comment, Barry is the most visible representative we've had in a long time, and he comes to breakfast and other meetings, and he stays around and listens to people, so I'm always impressed with that. But earlier on, you laid a heavy burden on the Congress, primarily the House of Representatives, because they cover so much, the money and everything. But isn't the shortness of that period a part of the problem? Because a representative gets elected, goes to Washington, and they've only got 2 years, and it seems as though they spend a lot of that 2 years running again, for another term. And a lot of these problems that we're getting involved with, except on TV, you can't clear it up in an hour or a year or anything. And is there some way that some of these things could be addressed, things that the individual congressmen or women could do, like a standing committee or something of the sort that would address the problem and keep it going, even if that particular representative loses that term, but the possible solution keeps on. Is it at all possible to do?
A couple of aspects of that. One, of course, any piece of legislation that is not passed during a Congress, during the 2-year term of the Congress, dies, and it has to be reintroduced. It doesn't survive into the next Congress. There was some question about that during the Clinton impeachment. We impeached Clinton in the House, 2 articles of impeachment in December of 1998, and but the case didn't go to the Senate for trial until January of 1999, which was a new Congress. That survives. As long as the House has taken action, it doesn't matter if the Senate trial takes place in the next Congress or not, but that's a rare exception. Basically, whatever a Congress does during its 2-year term dies with that Congress, and it has to start over again.
Isn't there a way to carry it on, to make it stay?
Well, there are appropriations, multi-year appropriations. That's one way. And of course, if in fact the Congress, a particular Congress, passes a piece of legislation and it goes to the president to sign it, then that continues unless a later Congress passes a piece of legislation amending it and so forth. I don't have any problem with 2-year terms for members of the House. Going out there and running for re-election is one of the best ways to have a member of Congress stay in touch with people. If they had a 6-year term like senators, you might not see them for 5 years. And I think that's going to be a problem next year.
Yeah, it is.
So I don't have any problem with that. Plus the fact is, I think you might have been mentioning, Michael, before, earlier at the beginning of today's program, 90-something% of members of Congress, particularly members of the House, are reelected. Same as in the state. So there is a great deal of continuity from that standpoint. But the bottom line is there's no substitute for we the people staying involved and continuing to press these issues year after year after year, regardless of whether it overlaps with a new Congress coming in. That's the problem. We the people lose interest. We go off and do other things. And that's understandable to some extent. I mean, we all have lives to live, families to raise, jobs to maintain, and so forth. But I think if we pick our issues wisely, rather than try and deal with everything, every one of us deal with everything. I tried to do this when I was in the House, to focus on those issues that my background put me in a position to know a little bit more about, legal issues and so forth, and for which I therefore had a little more credibility because people knew, for example, that I'd served as a U.S. attorney and had some background in that arena. So I tried to focus my energies on those issues so that I would have some continuity and more credibility. I'm not sure that's what you were asking about, but we have to remain involved and not allow our interest to lag simply because an election is over or a new Congress is coming in.
Did you find that other members of the House felt the same way that you did and behaved in the same manner?
Well, unfortunately, a lot of members of the House, to some extent because of the way redistricting has taken place in recent years, they know that once they get elected, it's almost impossible to unelect them. The 6th district was an aberration. Karen Handel lost last year after just, well, not even one term. But normally, if a member is elected, they have a very high degree of certainty that they're going to be able to stay in that job as long as they want, because the way redistricting has strengthened incumbency. And that's another problem. Is that what we really want? Or would we rather have districts that are at least to some degree competitive so that the member can't just sit back and rely on the fact of incumbency to be reelected? That's a problem, I think. So there's kind of two sides to it. At least.
So I'd like to start by dropping 2 citations and then get to my questions. The first one was,
Stay on the same topic.
it is the same topic, these are supporting the topic for
And
me.
he has 10 minutes, Chairman, right?
We have
Quite as
eight-
much information.
We have 8 minutes to go.
There was a case that went to the Supreme Court where a couple in Colorado were held in violation of EPA regs there with regards to water lands on their property. They had to go to the Supreme Court in order to establish their right to be heard by a judge. The regulations written by the EPA said they were only entitled to be heard in an administrative court that was part of the EPA. There's the one citation. The other thing I want to bring up there is the third form of law. There's laws that are passed by our legislature, there's case law that is created by court precedent, and then there is administrative law, which is much less well known but is growing at a frightening pace. So the topic and the question here is that the executive power has amassed legislative power through delegation from the Congress. The 1976 National Emergency Act is an excellent example of that. The War Powers Act would be an even larger one. And then through things like these administrative courts, they're seizing judicial power as well. It is not just legislative power that's being poached on by the regulatory powers of the executive branch. Are you aware of any actions or any precedents that have been set by federal courts that would invalidate any of these power grabs under separation of powers?
I mean, there have been cases that have gone to the Supreme Court. There's one in particular, a well-known case, I just can't think of the name of it offhand. But they're few and far between. Partly the result of the expense of litigating these issues. It's extremely expensive, and oftentimes only very large corporations or associations have the resources to carry these things through. That's part of the problem. Part of the problem is the legal barriers, procedural barriers that our federal court system has placed between a citizen and being able to obtain judicial relief, whether it's regulatory or criminal, so that it is far more difficult, bordering on impossible, for most of us to have standing in order to even challenge these things. Then, of course, as sort of a side issue, you have the state secrets doctrine. That is a made-up doctrine that allows the government to not even have to answer a lawsuit. They can have it thrown out simply because they say, if this case proceeds even to the point where we have to answer it, it will endanger national security. This is a doctrine that came about largely in modern times as a result of I think it might have been a C-130. Didn't have to do with the C-130, but they were testing some new electronic equipment, I think, that was classified. And there were contractors that were doing this. The plane crashed. The private contractors operating under the contract with the government were killed. Their survivors sued for benefits, claiming that negligence on the part of the government. The government came in, this is back in the early 1950s, came in and said, this is all classified. If we have to answer this, information will necessarily be released that will endanger the national security. The court said, oh, okay. Well, that doctrine is continued even to cases today, these days. Even in the face of the fact that years later, when all of that information that the government relied on to avoid having to answer that lawsuit became unclassified and was shown to have been specious. There was no national security. The government just didn't want to be liable for it. Notwithstanding that, the courts still allow this doctrine. So you have, the expense of these things in order to obtain standing, the rightness of the case, all of these barriers, and then this made-up doctrine of state secrets that are placed in the way of a citizen, small business, for example, being able to really challenge what the regulatory state is doing. The case that you mentioned, I remembered it also had to do with the massive fines that were imposed on the couple. Every day that went by, it became this huge fine, and until it got to the Supreme Court, as I recall, they weren't even. You're right. The court said, "Well, this isn't an issue for the courts. This is administrative," which is utter nonsense. It affects these individuals, their property rights, more so than anything else. And they had to, it took years in order for that case to even get up there. And they were very fortunate. I don't know whether it was the Institute for Justice that helped them. IJ was the group that handled the Tibbs case, because the Institute for Justice, for those of you not familiar with it, is a great organization. And this goes back to your question, Jim. How can we, what can we as citizens do? One of the things we can do is to support organizations like the Institute for Justice that have the resources to take on these issues and see them through. Because the court system, rather than being a vehicle that encourages citizens to assert their rights as against the government, has become just the opposite. Federal courts by and large now look for reasons not to take cases, not to provide an avenue for relief to the citizens, rather than the way it should be.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank
Bob,
you.
thank you very, very much. You have taken full measure of the time, and you've done just a great job. And I'm very, very proud of all the Madison Forum members asking the intelligent and insightful questions that they have. I want to leave it with one quick question of reflection for everyone. But if you want to comment, please do.
You do have 1 minute.
I do. I'll talk fast. I'll talk fast. With social media, Facebook, we see that our privacy has been greatly diminished. They know every pill that you're taking from the doctor. So in that light, there is virtually no privacy anymore. How does that affect Roe versus Wade and the right to privacy for an abortion?
I never, and I've read the decision, I've never understood the basis for that decision. It was made up. It's not a right to privacy, it is a right to life. It's basically the taking of a life. It to me doesn't have anything to do with privacy. Now, I'm a strong advocate, as you know, of the right to privacy. I remember what Ayn Rand said I think it was in The Fountainhead, that if you take away a man's privacy, you gain the power to control him absolutely. It's extremely important, and we are losing it. Part of that is simply the technology that corporations legitimately have developed. Part of it is the unwillingness of government to look at those aspects of privacy and the use of that information that do fall within, a legitimate area for government to regulate. Not everything, but certainly there are some areas. To me, Roe v. Wade was not about privacy. That was a made-up notion of privacy in order to reach the result that they couldn't otherwise, on the law, reach.
Bob, thank you very much.